Hi everybody, and welcome to the Wild Learners channel. Today we're doing episode 10, which is facing challenges and building student accountability. I really appreciate everybody's patience this week. I know this video is late. It was supposed to be posted on Monday, but here in the area that I live in, it's been insanely cold and has caused a lot of, we'll say, difficulties this week to get much of anything but staying warm done. So I'm just now getting to this video, and I think it's going to be well worth the wait. This is something that I've actually been researching a lot. It's something that has been really heavy on my heart. It's something that I feel like can be kind of controversial, and that's not my intention at all in this video. But I do think that there is kind of a call to action. I think there is something that needs to be maybe discussed or directed a little bit more in our society when it comes to this topic. So I hope you'll at least hear me out. I hope that you'll know that I have the best intentions when I'm talking about these things, and I'm going to kind of outline those for you and kind of talk about why students need accountability. So I hope that this is going to be helpful for you. I hope this is something that you're willing to listen to, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so I'm going to be looking down at my notes a lot today. I just want to give you a heads up because I took a lot of notes. I did a ton of research for this. I spent most of my Christmas break actually thinking about this topic and researching for it and really looking for really good evidence for this case that I'm going to make about students needing accountability. So I'm going to be referencing those notes a lot just to make sure I'm giving you accurate information as I found. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about is just as a teacher, I would say that the number one reason that I hear peers leaving the field is because students lack accountability or parents lack accountability. It's been something that has caused teachers to leave because we can only motivate students so much. We can't actually force students to do the work. We can't force students to choose certain behaviors. And the worst part about that is a lot of times teachers are held accountable for that, even though we can't really make a student change. We can try to empower them, we can try to model, we can try to encourage, we can try to motivate, we can try to do all of those things, but as we all know, humans have free will and we can make our own choices, and sometimes we don't always make the right choices, and sometimes, especially with human nature, it's actually more beneficial to not make the right choices. And if that has proven to be the easier route for students, unfortunately that becomes a habit, and once that is established, it's really hard to break. And so I know most of the people that I once knew in education are no longer in education. And I'm not gonna lie, it's something that I struggled with a lot in public school. It's something that I still occasionally struggle with, even with my school here, is how to get students to have accountability, how to let parents know that their student might need more accountability, and letting their student take accountability for some choices that they make, whether it's, positive choices or negative choices. So with that said, I think the biggest thing that we need to differentiate here is the difference between accountability and responsibility, because they are very different. So this is a definition that I found that I really, really liked about the difference between accountability and responsibility. And accountability has to do with your ethical or moral internalization, whereas responsibility has to do more with your duty or personal choice. So accountability is how a student would react or take ownership of the results of their task or work, whereas responsibility is, the responsibility to complete certain tasks or work or projects. So there's a difference there, as in I have a responsibility to make sure that my students are learning the Indiana state standards, right? But accountability would be the quality to which I am executing like my lesson plans or projects, and to the extent or depth to which my students are learning the content. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a difference there. Accountability is being aware of your mistakes and owning them, whereas responsibility is more task-oriented, and accountability is more response ownership. So I hope that clears that up a little bit. So what would accountability look like for different ages? So I think that's probably the second most important thing that we need to talk about, because obviously accountability for like a 4, 5, maybe even 6-year-old is going to look very different than accountability for like a 12, 13, 14-year-old. And so I kind of want to talk about that. There's actually a lot of research out there. I do want to preface this with some very alarming, to me anyway, maybe not to you, you might agree with it, and that's completely fine. For me, I found it somewhat alarming that when it comes to child development, there's always certain milestones or stages that we associate with certain ages. Now, obviously, if a student or a child isn't meeting certain goals by that exact time, you know, it's not the end of the world. There's definitely some give and take in there, right? And I think that there's a huge whole picture that you have to look at when you're looking at child development and progress and expectations of meeting certain goals. But overall, because of COVID, a lot of students academically, socially, physically, so I mean, like all the things, right, are not meeting those goals. And I mean, some of it definitely falls on being on lockdown, missing school. We know that virtual learning does not work. You're lacking so much of the actual like tangible part of learning that we know is essential to long-term memory and things like that. My concern is, though, what I have found is that instead of trying to correct those things by trying to work on the students that are lacking and like helping them meet these goals, instead we are taking the goals and we are I don't want to say dumbing them down, because we're not like dumbing them down, but we're definitely like lowering the expectation for kids. And if you know me and my teaching style, I have a huge problem with that, because if we are lowering our expectation for kids, then they're going to lower their expectations for themselves. And I don't think the human race has really changed that much in the last 3 years. I mean, socially, there's an argument that we have definitely changed, but I think there's an argument that we did not change for the good. We actually have regressed quite a bit socially. And by changing the benchmarks for child development based on these new findings of where we're seeing kids it's like directly correlated to COVID. I don't think it's good. I think we should be putting things in place to help bridge that gap versus just meeting them where they are and saying, nope, that's the new standard, because we are actually going to be hurting kids, because kids haven't changed that much. If you look at it, the suicide rate, the amount of mental illness in younger children, like I'm talking elementary age kids, is up. And I don't think that's because they don't feel like they can't meet certain expectations. I think it's because we're not giving them opportunities to meet those expectations. We're not pushing them. We're not having them grow. If you think about those intrinsic motivators for yourself and that feeling you get when you have to struggle, but you finally accomplish something and you own it and you're proud of it, we're not giving kids these expectations anymore. And we're going to get into this a lot, because there's a lot of reasons why that's not happening. And I don't think any of them are good. And again, this is my own personal opinion. I encourage you to do your own research. And think about it critically on your own. Again, this is just coming from me as an educator, as a mother, as somebody who's doing homeschool and trying to be countercultural to try to change the way that education's been presented to our children and to make an argument for another way of education. So take this for what you will, okay? So again, we're going to get into what accountability looks like at different ages. What I found was really surprising is in some states, depending on what it is, 7-year-olds can be held like legally responsible for their actions, which kind of blew my mind. I think that on a social level that 7-year-olds are far capable of knowing right from wrong. I think that they definitely are going to push boundaries and explore where those boundaries are. I think that's a natural part of human instinct, even beyond just being 7 years old. But I found that like super surprising. But I guess kind of like from my own interpretation of the data that I was looking at and the research that I was studying and my own experience with children over the last almost 20 years, I kind of feel like there's not really a standard for development. I think that we can have like a guideline. I think that that's a good thing to have, is to try to meet certain guidelines by certain ages. But I think we need to be careful that if our child's maybe not meeting a pinpointed exact, like a certain developmental goal by a certain age, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the child. So I do think we need to be careful with that. But as far as like standard for development, I think that there's so many variants, especially right now with the stuff that has been going on in our society and the things that look like they're going to continue to go on in our society. I think that we need to be careful, and we definitely need to make adjustments, and it may not be as cut and dry as it used to be, but I do still think that they should be goals. But I would say on average, from what I have experienced personally and from what developmental experts in the field have seen and have done testing on, 4-year-olds are able to start regulating and understanding the difference between right and wrong. And historically, that's why we start seeing 5-year-olds in our kindergarten and start getting a little bit more of that full day type thing. And I mean, there's a whole argument about whether that's developmentally appropriate, and I understand that. I don't think there is enough play in schools. I think there's definitely ways that we could be doing it better. But at 5 years old, historically, children have been able to self-regulate, know the difference between right and wrong. They understand social interactions with their peers, so they understand like if I'm mean to my peer, there's going to be a consequence for that. They understand that cause and effect is what I'm trying to say. Now, it doesn't mean they're always going to make the right choices, and that doesn't mean they're always going to understand maybe the magnitude of those consequences of their actions, but they definitely have the capability of learning. And I think this is where we start needing to hold students accountable more and really talking to them about the results of and consequences of choices that they're making, because they are able to start understanding that. And I think that 5 years old, that's a really good age to start setting that framework for the development of your personal self, because they are going to be, interacting with their peers a lot more. They are physically able to do different activities, whether they're in some kind of organized sport or just church activities or whatever. They're going to be participating more with other children in different ways, so they are at a different age or experience level than somebody who's like maybe 3 or 4. Let me kind of look at this real quick. So again, like we talked about, they can verbally share their feelings and ideas. They can plan, think ahead. They can understand social norms. And this is from the American Psychological Association. This is something that I learned like all through my time studying deeply in child development. And again, it's something that I've seen from my experience, and it's something that I've adhered to with my own children. And I found that it has, for the most part, worked. Again, kids are going to be kids, and I think we need to have that in the back of our minds and understand that. But I think what we need to really think about, though, is when kids start pushing back on that and refuse to listen, to refuse to accept the accountability for their actions, then I think we have a deeper problem here. And I don't think it has to do with developmental stuff. I think it has more to do with intrinsic motivators, which we're going to get into. So just to kind of end this part of the segment out, again, this is just kind of like an intro to what we're going to be talking about. This is just kind of like the foundation that we're going to build on for the rest of the video. But I really feel like a lack of these, guidelines really for child development has more to do with a cultural shift away from expectations, and it's a lack of accountability and training from parents. And I know that's hard to hear, and I really spent a lot of time trying to figure out if I was even going to say that, because I know a lot of people are going to be very hurt and angry about that. But I'm here to tell you, as a parent, I have failed. But I have taken those failings and realized that, maybe my kids were not where they should be with certain areas of their social or even academic goals. And I have corrected myself so I could help correct them. And I think that we kind of live in a day and age where it's really hard to take accountability and admit that we're wrong. And I think that it's really important to understand that, like, you're gonna be wrong. You're gonna mess up. It's how you take that accountability again, how you take that result, that consequence of maybe making the wrong choice, or maybe it was even the wrong choice. Maybe it was just like you made what you thought was the right choice, but it wasn't. But taking that, learning from it, and readjusting and trying to do something different to get a better result. That's all I'm saying here, is that I think that there's been a lot of fad parenting movements. Again, I'm trying to be very careful because, you are free to parent your children however you want, and I understand that. But I think we also need to understand, no matter how we choose to parent our children, there's going to be certain consequences for those choices. So, there's going to be there's going to be certain outcomes from gentle parenting. There's going to be certain outcomes from authoritative parenting. There's going to be, certain outcomes from everything in between, right? And nobody's going to be perfect. But I do feel like there is a need to have accountability for ourselves as parents. I think that there needs to be a need to also hold our children accountable as well. And I think as a culture, we're kind of shifting away from anybody doing wrong and being very accepting of everybody's journey. And I can really appreciate that. Because I have made mistakes, and I love being in a society where, I'm not stoned for doing the wrong thing every time I do the wrong thing. My problem is when we're not saying, okay, I did do the wrong thing. Thank you for accepting that and not judging me, but then taking it and changing your actions to then do something better. I hope that makes sense. And I hope that I'm not stepping on any toes here. I really just am trying to be genuine here, because I really feel like we are in a pretty dire situation with our kids. If you've watched the news, if you've been online at all, you know how bad this is. We have high schoolers that are reading at a 4th grade level. We have high schoolers and elementary schoolers and middle schoolers and everything in between hitting and kicking their teachers. They're stealing. They're bringing weapons into school. And there's really no accountability for that. There's really no harsh outcomes to show them, like, no, this is not acceptable. And I think that we're really hurting our kids by not doing that, because, like, at high school level, you should be reading a lot higher than 4th grade. Again, we can't make them do that. As teachers, I can't be like, no, you have to read this. You have to answer these questions. I can try to motivate it. I can try to make it fun. I can try to do all these things that we're taught to do. But at the end of the day, I can't hold their pencil and make them do it. They have to want to do it on their own. Most kids may not want to do that, but they need to understand that if they don't do it, there's going to be a consequence, and that consequence is going to be followed through. Not everything is going to be something that they want to learn all the time, but it's something that they have to learn and need to learn. So again, we're going to get into this a little bit more. If you have hung with me, I appreciate it. I promise that this is going to be good to talk about. So in our next section, I really want to talk about best practices, because I do think that as teachers, we do have a duty to motivate and do whatever we can within our ability to have students get accountability. So we're going to talk about that next. All right, so this is directed towards educators and parents, and this is all about how to get your students to have accountability, like the best practices, ways to motivate, things like that. So some ways that we can prepare our students or our children to be accountable is by, well, first I would say is meeting Bloom's taxonomy. So if you're in education, you know all about Bloom. If you're new to like homeschooling, or you're kind of doing the onschooling, or you're just a parent looking for some ways to help build accountability, Bloom's is a pyramid. It's been revised several times throughout the last couple decades, but usually it's a pyramid, and it's the needs of a child before they can actually start learning. And it's like things like making sure they're fed, making sure they feel safe, making sure that like their outside environment isn't having negative contributions to their learning environment. So if you're not familiar with that, maybe I can do a deeper video on it, or you can just do a quick search on Google and you'll have a ton of resources come up. But so I would say start at Bloom's taxonomy and make sure that all of those needs are met first. And then I think that as teachers, we need to have clear expectations. So with my class, I've shared in other videos, we create our classroom expectations together. One, that means that they have buy-in, and two, they're physically present and they're engaging in this as well. So it's not just me telling them, they are actively participating and they are agreeing to and helping create the expectations for our classroom. So they should be pretty clear at that point. I don't think that that's just where it ends though. And I will admit this is probably my biggest failing as a teacher is the following through. I'd like to think it's because I have a soft heart, but I think that by not having the follow through that I've actually hurt some situations more by not by not giving the consequence every time that I said is going to happen. And here's why. So this is me sharing my personal story and my experience with this. So I have a huge heart for kids, and I'm gonna start crying. And I understand that there are things that happen and there are battles that we're all fighting, and I believe kids have that as well, maybe even more because they have less control over situations. So when a behavior is continuing, and I'm not talking like a one-off, I'm talking about a certain behavior being a continual problem and maybe even progressively getting worse. I have a heart for these kids because I was kind of that naughty kid growing up, and it had nothing to do with wanting to be naughty. I definitely feel like I had teachers that did not like me. I was always picked on because I'm really tall and always have been really tall. There was just a lot of factors that played into it. I didn't want to constantly be in trouble, but I was constantly in trouble. And at one point, I even remember I was in second grade thinking to myself, well, this looks fun. I'm gonna get in trouble anyway. I might as well do it. And I did. And I kind of became one of those kids there for a while. So I have some personal experience with this with some kids. I also wholeheartedly believe that relational connections between student and teachers are very important. I think that can make a difference. I had a student my first year teaching that all the other teachers were like, oh, watch out for this kid, watch out for that kid. And I was really deliberate in trying to make a connection with him. And again, I've talked about this in other videos. My husband and my newborn son would come in on Fridays and have lunch, and he just really wanted that connection with an adult male. He wanted to be part of this like family, so he loved being around my son and me and my husband. And so for him, that Friday lunch with my family was a huge motivation to him, and he actually felt loved and connected. And I had a few things, but I didn't have near any of the problems that some of the other teachers had previously had with him. And for me, that was a huge, especially as a first year teacher, like it kind of like set this bar for like how important relationships were with students. So I always tried to build huge relationships with students. And as you know, if you're an educator, you spend as much time honestly more, you spend more time with these like waking hours with these kids than you maybe even do your own kids or they do with their own parents. So it's like impossible not to love these kids, right? Like you're pouring into them every day. You're trying to create content that's engaging and fun, and you're trying to grow their experiences. So like you're pouring your heart and soul into these kids. So it's impossible not to love them, right? So when it comes to setting clear expectations and following through, it can be very difficult sometimes because I find myself constantly making excuses for students and trying to maybe be more of a buddy than and again, this is hard to say, and I'm even reflecting back, like them being the authority that I need to be. I have a responsibility to these students to, yes, build a relationship with them, but to also teach them in this safe environment that if they make certain decisions, there's going to be real consequences. And it's my job to model that for them. It's my job to set that expectation for them so that when they're, out of my class or they're somewhere else in the world, they think about that before they make a bad choice and potentially put themselves in a harmful or, just a real life scenario where they're not thinking about the consequences. Because education is more than just reading, writing, and all those things. You're teaching them how to function in real life. They're learning social skills, and I mean, there's so much to it. So that's something that I feel like I am really going to need to, or have been and will continue to be working on, is being a little bit firmer with following through on consequences. And I know it's hard. I mean, especially for educators, because you might not always have the backing of administration. You rarely have the backing of parents, or parents will automatically assume you're just doing it to isolate or incriminate their child, and you obviously know that's not the case, and that one can be super hurtful. It can be super unmotivating to stay in the field, and it can also cause you to really lose that passion, because you're doing this out of love, and to have somebody tell you that you're not can be really devastating. So sometimes it can feel like it's easier just to avoid the conflict by maybe not sending them home when they should be getting sent home, or not maybe writing that incident report when that incident report should be written. But I'm going to tell you, from experience, when something finally happens that is serious, even if you have talked to parents about these things, if you haven't done the formal complaints, if you haven't sent them home, and that big thing finally happens, and you do not have that, had not followed through with what you have put in your handbook as being the consequences or whatever, it's going to cause more problems. And so I'm telling you now that you need to follow through. I know that it can be hard on your heart because you care about your parents, you care about these kids, it can be an inconvenience to parents and all of these things, but I'm telling you, you need to just do it. It's going to help set a better standard for your environment, for your classroom environment or your home, if it's with your own kids, and I'm telling you, you need to do it. So anyway, there's my thing on following through. So setting clear expectations and following through. I also think that sometimes that creating low stakes tasks can be really helpful. And again, that's because we're in a safe environment, so we can, hear if kids get into a little bit of a tiff, I will let it go for so long. And again, that kind of depends on what kids and what the situation is and things like that. And if you've been around kids and the kids, where that line is where you need to intervene. But letting them kind of work it out themselves and letting some feelings come up so that they can see that, like, things that they say or, taking a toy away or whatever is going to hurt their friend, and letting them see that and experience that so they can own it and have that experience themselves. I also think that explaining your purpose is really important. So, if you have clear expectations, something happens, you follow through. I think it's super important to maintain that relationship and to build understanding, to go back to that student and say, okay, this is why we have this rule. This is why we're following through. This is why this consequence is happening. Next time, let's try to do this. And, maybe that's talking, if it's an older student, talking together and creating a plan for how to avoid the same situation happening again. If it's a younger student, maybe it's thinking about your environment and taking away certain components that maybe start causing some of those problems. Or, if it's just, some people really just don't like each other, and that's okay. And I think we need to be more accepting of that some kids are just never going to like each other. And that's okay. but I think as students or as teachers, we need to be really purposeful in like knowing those relationships and like trying to avoid pitting those kids together for certain projects. And that doesn't really happen so much in my classroom here anymore because we're small and it's more of a family homeschool thing. So it's a lot different. But in public school, I experienced that a lot, and I think trying to force a friendship is ridiculous. You can't force somebody to be friends with somebody genuinely, and we need to respect that of these kids. I think that it's also important for kids to understand the personal benefit to doing the right thing and owning their consequences. So I think that, like for example, if a kid, hits another child, and maybe this has been a continual problem, this hasn't been like a one-off kind of thing. Talking to them and being like, okay, first try to get to the bottom of it. Like, why are we hitting? A lot of times, I don't think older students probably do, but younger students can't always recognize what that is. So you might have to help them through it, or you might not just get an answer, and that's okay too. But I think that explaining to them like the negative consequences, obviously, of hitting somebody, but then the positives of what would happen if we did something differently. Like instead of hitting, maybe we say, hey, you did this and it hurt my feelings, or hey, I don't like it when you do this, you need to stop. Or maybe just coming and getting a teacher and removing yourself from that situation completely is the way to go. Now I know in public school, and this is why, again, I got out of public school, it's not always possible when you have a class of 32 to have a student come to you with every little tip they're having and being able to navigate that. But I think it's really critical to like relationship building, and that's why I really struggled with it morally, because I felt like, these are big issues to these kids. To us adults, it might seem like whatever, get over it, but to them it's not like that. I mean, this is the experience that they have so far, and like they aren't always necessarily equipped to be able to deal with it, and that's our job as adults to help them. And a lot of times I was not seeing that need being met in public school, and it's not from a lack of teachers caring, it's from you have 32 students and you have way bigger fish jumping out of the lake that you're trying to get back in before you can like help this kid over here. So, but I think that's like really critical part of all of this. I also think that, and like again, personal, like what we just talked about, not making excuses for students. Yes, we can know that, hey, maybe this child has a self-regulation issue. Maybe this child has a neurodivergent tendency or whatever. Those definitely play into it, but they should not become excuses. We still have a responsibility to this child to teach them the wrong and the right way to interact with their peers or how to hold themselves accountable. By continually making excuses for them, we are telling them that it is okay to continue on this course. And unfortunately, at some point, they're going to have to make that decision on their own when they're older. And this has always worked for them. Somebody's always made an excuse for them. It's going to be a lot harder for them to find that intrinsic motivation. It's going to be a lot harder for them to start changing their ways. So I think it's very important from the very beginning to not make excuses. As teachers, it's always important for us to model appropriate behavior. So even when you're in the moment and you're super frustrated and like a serious incident just happened, and I can speak to this, we kind of had something happen that completely caught me off guard. It was a very emotional and very serious incident. You have to keep your cool because you are the adult. You're the one modeling for these students like how to navigate the situation. And I think it's really important to do that, especially I mean, not even just in the moment, but I mean like following through, because like especially if you're in public school, admin might not be backing you up, parents might be telling you you're a horrible person, making all these accusations that aren't true. It's still really important that you're modeling for your students even throughout this, that you are happy to see them, that you love them, and that you're handling this logically and not emotionally, I think is really important, which can be really hard because I mean it does evoke an emotional response. But we're adults, we're supposed to be able to self-regulate that and model that for students. Again, following through with consequences, I think that it's also really important for them to see that like failure can be a positive thing. And I think that this goes along with being accountable and not making excuses, being like, yes, what you did was wrong. And because it was wrong, this is what happened. But now we know that this wasn't a good choice. So what are some choices we could do next time? And like telling them like you're going to become a better person for making these choices. You're going to grow. Your friends are going to respect you. You're going to respect yourself more. And like giving them all of these positives to their failures instead of just being like, I mean, you should never, and I don't think most of us are inclined to do this, make a child feel like they're horrible for what they did. I think you should definitely avoid making them feel horrible, but letting them know like, yeah, this was wrong. This is going to have a consequence, but we can change. We all can change, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with setting those best practices in place. If you have these foundations in place, I think it's going to be very helpful for you from the very beginning. Like I said, I am a veteran teacher at this point. I've been in lots of different programs, lots of different schools. I've done teacher trainings, and like obviously I'm not an expert in all the areas. I just admitted I have areas that I am still continuing to work on, and I think that's important. I think that without that accountability, there's no growth, right? We need that personal growth. We're always going to be growing. We need to have a growth mindset. And to have that growth mindset, we need to understand that we have failures and there's consequences, but we're going to correct those. So, all right. So in our next section, we're going to be talking about what to do if a student or parent, or kind of like a combination of both, refuses to have accountability for a situation. So we're going to get into that in our next section. Okay, so this one is always the hardest as an educator. As a parent, this probably isn't quite as hard because you can kind of think about this on your own and kind of like think about, okay, well maybe I'm not holding myself accountable as much as I should in this area, or my kid accountable in this area. It's always harder as an educator to confront somebody else's child, or even let the parents know that there's not enough accountability, because it does come off as a personal attack. And I think it's very important that as educators, we try to be as gentle as we can, try to be as clear as we can, and that we let parents know why we're thinking this, or letting the student know why we're thinking that. And we're going to get into this more. So before we start though, I think that the most common reasons that parents avoid making their child take accountability, or even holding themselves as parents accountable, is just this, it comes down to negative feelings, right? As parents, we love our kids so much. I think that's universal. Everybody loves their children, and everybody thinks they have the best children in the world. I mean, like, I know I do, so I'm sure you do too, right? Like we love our kids. We pour ourselves into our kids, right? As a teacher, I love my students, all of my students, right? So as a parent, it's a lot stronger in that I don't want my kids to experience negative behavior or negative feelings, right? I don't want to instill a sense of inadequacy. I don't want my kids to feel like they're not good enough, or that I'm not proud of them, right? So we tend to be very positive. We tend to like really kind of avoid our kids experiencing negative feelings. As a teacher, the same way, because oftentimes if you like, even dealing with discipline, if you're doing it the right way, modeling the appropriate responses and things like that, just the action of telling a child that their behavior has consequences can often set off an even bigger negative response, whether that's throwing a tantrum, acting very aggressively towards you or other students because they're embarrassed, it has a consequence, right? And we try to avoid those situations. So I do think that that's probably the most common reason that parents and teachers don't always hold children accountable when they should. When it comes to a child or a parent not wanting to take accountability for, schoolwork not being done, not putting their best effort in, or, being a bully or whatever it is, unfortunately, as a teacher, there's not much you can do. You can try to, teach accountability in your classroom. I try to do that. We read lots of books on how to be kind and, how to, different social experiences and ways to handle that. Like one of our favorite books is like, What Do You Do with a Problem? I love those books. There's a whole series. There's a whole bunch of other ones as well that you can look to, and we incorporate those a lot. We have a lot of community circles talking about expectations and things like that. But like I said earlier in the video, you cannot force a child or a parent or anybody else for that matter to do what you want. It's got to be their choice. So really we're coming into how do we build that intrinsic motivation to do the right thing. But back to what you can do if they're refusing that. It can be very hard then in your classroom because it can cause a distortion in a relationship between you and the parent. It can cause a distortion between you and the student. So how do you continue to work on that and try to fix those things while also trying to fix the behavior? It can be very complicated. And it can complicate a lot of things, right? But I think it's really important that you maintain that relationship first with that student. Recognize that, you're not angry at the student themselves. You're angry at the behavior. You're maybe angry at the lack of accountability, but as a person, you understand that they're still developing and that you have a responsibility as an adult to come alongside them and try to teach them. Now, whether they take those teachings and apply them is up to them. That's like all you can do, right? And so being able to accept that you have done what is within your capabilities, what's within your wheelhouse, I think is the most important thing. Because I think as teachers, we often spend so many nights, right, wondering like, what if I did this? What if I did that? Did I do this enough? Did I do that enough? And like, we know the answer, right? Because we know what our limitations are. We know what the reality is, and we know whether we put our full effort into it or not, right? And so that's just something you're going to have to answer for yourself. But if the answer is there is nothing left that I could have done differently, there's not anything else I could have implemented to help, then I think you have your answer, and you just have to accept that at this point you have done what you can. Continue to do those things, continue to pour into the student, but at that point you are free of those choices because you have set the expectation, you have followed through with your consequences, you have made those things clear, you've communicated with parents, etc., so that it no longer falls on you. And I think that's really important to remember. It's something that I am still learning to try to remember and work on as well. I think that, if you are in my situation where you're doing like a homeschool co-op, where you're not in like a public school, where you're kind of like the director or whatever, I think it's really important to have a written code of conduct like in your handbook to refer to. I think that it's really good for parents to know what the expectation is, and two, I think that, and I need to do this more on my own as well, following through with those expectations, right? Like 3 negative behaviors in a row of a certain seriousness, right, results in you having to come pick up your student. You need to follow that. That's in your handbook. The parents were clear on the expectations. Now you need to follow through. If you tell us a parent like, hey, I've tried this and this and that, I feel like this is beyond what I am capable of helping with, I don't feel like I feel like we've been communicating and there hasn't been a lot of change. If you make a decision as a professional with your own program then you need to hold yourself to that, because you obviously came to that conclusion for a reason, and you need to stick with it. You need to stick to that for the best of the other students, for the best of yourself, for the best of your program. I'm not saying there can't be some negotiation. I don't think that, that's off the realm of things to do, but I think you really need to stick to the things that you know, the things that you've seen, and the things that you put into place to make sure that you have a safe environment for your class. So it's going to be very different for people in public school, right? Because you don't have that capability. You can't be like, I don't think this is a good fit, or, putting certain parameters in place. A lot of times those freedoms are not allotted to you. And so in the public school setting, I would say if you have a parent that is not making their kid have accountability, the student is not having accountability, again, that's where you just have to be like, okay, I'm going to continue to do the right thing. I'm going to continue to pour into this kid, but I'm no longer going to take responsibility or accountability for their actions, because I have done this, I have done that, I have tried this, I have tried that, I have exhausted my options. At this point, it needs to be a choice on either the parent or the child or both's part, because it really does come down to working as a team to have the student acting the way they need to act. If those expectations are different at home and the accountability is not happening, then you can't expect them to come here and all of a sudden want to be held to those expectations, because there's not going to be accountability at home. They can get away with acting a certain way. And a lot of times those behaviors are because they either want something or it's avoidance, and they usually result in what the student wants, right? If they don't want to do paper and they are naughty and they're just flailing around and you're offering different choices, but they really just don't want to do anything, you can't make them. So by having you distracted with trying to find a way to get them to engage, they're getting what they want. They're usually getting the attention they want, because kids often don't care if it's negative or positive attention, and they're getting the avoidance. They're not doing the work. They're not having to engage in the content. So if that's being reinforced, it can be a really hard habit to break. I feel like we've talked about a lot, and unfortunately I feel like we've talked about a lot of negatives, and that's not how I want to end this video. So I really want to talk about some positive impacts when students have accountability, because this is really where my heart is. This is why I feel so strongly about holding students accountable and building that skill into their life. And as you can see, these are huge things. So if a student has accountability, they're going to have increased effort or input into their learning. Students that know that they're going to be held to a certain standard or expectation for their educational input, so their grades, their learning, things like that, they're going to put more into it. At first, it might be to avoid the consequences, but eventually it will become, because it has become rewarding for them to get that A. It is rewarding for them to finish their work. They feel good about themselves because they accomplished something. So yes, it might start out as not wanting to have a consequence. And I know some people think that that's a bad approach, but it's really not. That's really a way to start the motivation for them to build up and get to experience that feeling of accomplishment, for them to then take that and make it an intrinsic motivation. I also think that students that have accountability have a much higher capacity for decision-making skills, because before they just completely react to something, they're going to stop and think about the consequences, and they're going to make the better decision. So knowing again that there's going to be a consequence for their behavior, they're going to then be like, okay, do I want to accept this consequence, or would I rather do this? And most of the time they're going to want to do this other thing. And again, I think that by building good friendships, because they're being kind to their peers, by having a good educational or academic experience, it's going to create a lot more intrinsic motivation that way as well. Again, and that goes with their problem solving skills too. If they if they're thinking critically and have good decision-making skills, that's going to align with their critical thinking as well. Again, kids that have accountability are going to have a higher self-esteem. And that's because they have a sense of control over their actions, over themselves, and they will then feel like they have the capacity to make good decisions, to finish their work, to be respected by peers and other teachers and other adults. And that's really going to boost their self-confidence. And that's really what we want to see with kids. If we can get them to feel confident and know that they, are able to make good choices and learn from their bad choices, they're going to be a lot more willing to have a growth mindset. The same applies for adults, right? Adults with a higher self-confidence, like not a narcissistic confidence, like a really healthy self-confidence, are going to be the ones that are willing to take more chances because they know that if I make this mistake, I can come back, fix it, and do better next time. Accountability also increases their sense of empathy towards other people. If they are not accountable, and we talked about this before, and they are, if hitting this child, every time a child has a toy I want, hitting him makes him cry, and I can then go get this toy. And my worst consequence maybe is being told, that's not nice, don't do that. That is not enough of a consequence to make me want to stop doing it, right? And so I don't care what happens to Timmy as long as I'm getting my way, right? But if that consequence was harder and there was a relationship there where we could have a conversation about the outcome and the effects of that negative behavior, that would be enough motivation to that student next time to be like, last time I did this, A, B, and C happened. I did not enjoy A, B, and C, so I'm not going to do this to Timmy. As that progresses, that student will then probably build better friendships with their peers and realize that those relationships mean more to them than that toy does. And they will be able to actually have a healthy sense of empathy because they're actually engaging in healthy relationships with their peers. Again, accountability instills moral values even when no one's watching. So a lot of our early childhood is a lot of, cause and effect, right? Because they're learning, they're exploring, they're trying to figure this out. But once they hit that 4, 5, 6-year-old mark, I'd say really that 4 to 5, 6 is really late to be learning it. They're going to want to feel good about themselves because they have experienced that. They like that feeling. They kind of know that they want to be this kind of person. They're starting to understand that. And they're going to really want to be that even when nobody is watching because, one, it's become a habit, right? We're setting standards or expectations and they're reaching those expectations continually, which makes it a habit then. And they have experienced the positive outcomes to not doing whatever this behavior was in the beginning. And so that's really going to cause them to want to continue to do that even if the teacher or their parents aren't looking, because they know that even though the adult might not see it and they might not get consequences, their peers might see it or even they will see it. And because they have a confidence in themselves now, they don't want to let themselves down. So those are my biggest reasons for why students need to have accountability. I think that those are very important developmentally and socially. And I think that and I think this goes even for adults, because we have really gotten away from holding each other or ourselves accountable, that is why we have seen the digression in our social relationships culturally and globally. And I think that that's going to only continue to get worse if we don't start building better habits as a people. So I've talked a lot about motivation, so I just kind of want to touch on this a little bit because I haven't really gotten into it. But I know that if you're kind of new to homeschooling or you're new to education, maybe me talking about intrinsic motivation hasn't made a lot of sense. So I kind of just wanted to touch on that a little bit. So there are two different, there can be a lot of different variants of motivation, but the two most common variants of motivation is your intrinsic motivation and your extrinsic motivation. And so your intrinsic motivation is inward. That's where intrinsic comes from. So that's going to come within, that's your personal desire to accomplish a goal. Its extrinsic motivation is going to be, it comes from a reward or a consequence. So, a baseball player might have an intrinsic motivation if they want to be the best baseball player they can be, because that's what they want for themselves. That's their goal. It might be an intrinsic motivation because, if they become that best baseball player, the pay's higher, the fame's higher, things like that. So it doesn't mean that one's bad or one's good. I think that a lot of times they both work together, like in that example. But that's kind of the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. All right, so we did do some positives here about how accountability is important. We are going to quickly go over like what happens when children lack accountability to kind of counter what I was saying when children do have accountability. So the most common thing I see is they blame others. That obviously is not great for peer relationships. It's also not good for them because it's really going to stunt their personal growth. They have a refusal to follow rules because why? There's no consequence if they don't. And usually if there's no consequence and they're not following the rules, they're getting whatever they're wanting anyway. So it's actually of a benefit to them. A lot of times they'll justify their behavior because they're used to shifting the blame. So they'll try to justify it in some way to lessen the blame on them. I think that also obviously results in a lot of lack of trust and respect from their peers, which again is going to affect their social development. They're going to be dysfunctional adults because their boss isn't going to be able to come to them with a task and be like, I need these tasks done by this date, go do it. Because they're going to be able to be like, well, I've gotten out of doing things before by doing this and that, making excuses. And I'm not making it a priority because like, what's the worst that's going to happen, right? Well, unfortunately in the real world, you might get fired, you might lose your job, right? And that's a pretty serious consequence for an adult. But they haven't experienced that as a child, having a serious consequence. So they might not be equating that and thinking about that fully in their adult lives. I also find that children that don't have accountability really struggle with, like we said, their self-confidence. And I think because of that, they also really struggle with overcoming obstacles. And that's something I hate to see because children are so naturally inclined to overcome obstacles. They're so great at like thinking about very creative ways to, get around a problem or creating different outlets into something. And I think that children that lack that accountability have a very narrow mindset, and it makes it very hard for them to think critically and be able to overcome these obstacles, which is unfortunate because oftentimes they're just stunted. They, they're struggling with multiplication and they have used avoidance to get out of having to learn it. They're really just hurting themselves, right? Because multiplication is a skill you're going to use it. I use it every day in my life, whether it's, cooking or, budgeting or whatever. You're going to use it, and it's actually just going to hurt them in the long run. The resentment from peers is huge. And as a teacher, I'm here to tell you, like, once the peers start becoming afraid of or start not trusting a student within their community, it is really, really hard to rebuild that trust. And as adults, we probably know that. We've probably let somebody down, and it has taken a lot of work to rebuild that trust. And sometimes that relationship might not ever be the same. And so it can have a lot of really negative social, it can really impact their social development on a huge level. It also kind of encourages people to accept mediocrity. And I think that this is a huge problem for me because I think that, we as educators are trying to create like a love of learning, try to instill a growth mindset. We're trying everything we can to, offer choice or make this a project-based type thing. There's just so much work that goes into teaching, and I don't think a lot of people take that lightly. I think that we take it, we understand that like what we are pouring into these kids is like their experience with like this content, so it's huge, right? And we don't want to see mediocre students. We don't want them to accept mediocrity and want them to be like, oh, well, this is okay. Like, I'm doing the bare minimum and it's okay. Like, we want kids to like be the next, John Glenn's, or, like we want them to take what they're learning, love it, fall in love with it, and become these amazing people. Now, I'm not saying like it's always going to be academic. I think that some kids are amazing at working with their hands. Maybe they'll become like the next, best architect or the best veterinarian or whatever it is, but we want that for them. And by letting them just get by with mediocrity, we're telling them that that's it. Now, I'm not saying that like I was horrible in chemistry. What most people would consider mediocre was my best. Like, that was me like cramming for like 40 hours, like trying to understand this content. So I'm not saying it's always going to be an all content area, but like if you have a student that's accepting mediocrity in like all areas, there's a problem, and that student needs to have something that they love and is willing to grow in. It's also, again, just a burden for teachers and other adults when students don't have accountability, because at some point it falls on them. It's their choice. And a lot of times lack of accountability results in harm to others. It can result in harm to staff. It can really hurt your classroom environment. It can make it so that you can't do certain projects because this is going to be a potential harmful situation with the student because you can't trust them to make right choices. So you're kind of taking these experiences away from everybody else. And so then you have the whole fairness thing. Like, it can be a very complicated and very hard and delicate situation to handle. So with everything I've just said, with the positives and the negatives, I really hope you see the importance of having accountability, making our students or our children hold to accountability, even when it hurts us as parents or teachers, because it does. It's going to. We don't like seeing our kids sad. We don't like seeing them sad with themselves, but it's a natural human emotion that usually is the motivation to become better or do better. And honestly, by withholding that from them, we aren't doing them any favors. And I know it's hard for us, and that's why a lot of times you have the avoidance, even on the adult's part, of taking accountability or holding their child accountable. But with everything I've just shared, you can see that it's actually very detrimental to development in doing so. So again, I know this was this is like one of the heaviest topics I've ever done. I've been very intentional about my research and the way that I wanted to present this. I obviously could have presented this in a very sugar-coated kind of way. I could have sugar-coated it a lot more, but I didn't want to, because I feel like this is a very serious issue. I feel like this is something we really need to be addressing to help this next generation become really capable, amazing adults. I think it's something that we need to do for ourselves as educators and parents as well. And I think that this is a huge issue that a lot of schools are facing with this. I think this is the blame for a lot of the teacher shortages. I think this is the blame for just the mediocrity that we're seeing in public schools right now. So I really hope that this, at least even if you don't agree with everything I said, which is totally fine, I hope it at least got you thinking about some of the topics that I covered. I do want to say I have some amazing guests coming up here soon. I have Peter Kindfield, who is going to be talking with me here in some upcoming videos, and I also will be speaking with Jean Lomino, who is an amazing forest educator. She actually does the Forest Teacher Institute in Tennessee, and so I'll be talking with her as well, and just a whole bunch of other people in the field talking about their passions, the work they're doing, and hopefully that can just bring you some joy in these cold winter months. So it was really good to talk with you and just share some things that were heavy on my heart. I hope that you guys all have a great rest of your week. Stay warm and continue your good work. Bye.